This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, cultural workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Bettina Judd, who teaches in the Department of African American Studies at Emory University. She is a poet and critic whose research explores Black feminist methods and sensibilities. Along with a number of scholarly articles and published poems, she is the author of Feelin', Creative Practice, Pleasure, and Black Feminist Thought from 2023. In this conversation, we explore the origins of Black ways of knowing and knowledge production, the importance of cultural study for Black studies, and the place of creative work in the field. Good afternoon, Bettina. How are you?
I'm all right. Good afternoon, John. How are you?
I'm okay. I was telling you before I hit record, it's my first day after the last day of teaching. So definitely had one of those, got my kid off to school, went back and took a morning nap, and
Yes.
feeling refreshed.
I love the nap, the midday nap.
Oh, it's
vibe.
just, it feels like it's a nap that you've earned over months. But I'm really excited that we have a chance to talk today. I was really pleased when you said you were interested in being on the podcast, and we found time and day for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is you are a University of Maryland graduate as your PhD.
Well, go Terps, yes.
So we always like to have a little bit of local university representation when possible. But mostly, I just really love your work, and I think it's incredibly important, and it touches on so many of the aspirations of Black studies in terms of your creative work, your critical work, and the mixture that you bring to both of those things. And so that's just a way of saying welcome to the Black Studies Podcast, and I really look forward to talking with you today.
Thank you. I am a fan of the Black Studies Podcast, so I was super honored to be invited.
Well, it's going to be really good to have you on the series. It's absolutely our privilege. Well, obviously, I have a chance to talk about how you think about the field of Black studies, how you think about your work in relation to it, and all of these kinds of questions. But I wanted to start out with really the more personal question to ask you, what is it that drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And what keeps you connected to and sustains you in relation to this kind of work?
Yeah, I feel odd always bringing this up, but not so much, because it's quite a romantic answer, and that is my mother. My mother was the first graduate in what is now the Africana Studies program at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and so growing up in her household was Black studies. Those were the books in our little den. If I had a book report to do, my first resource was the Negro Almanac, if you remember that old collected tome. So much of my very young intellectual life has been completely tied to Black study. And, thinking about what books even are is connected to Black study because of my mother. And so I didn't ever think of myself as outside of Black studies, even as I went on to get my, bachelor's and then my PhD in comparative women's studies in English from Spelman, and then in what was then women's studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. Those were all Black studies to me. And so it does seem kind of like a beautiful whirlwind that I end up at a Department of African American Studies now. But I think my entire intellectual life has been inside of Black study.
I love that. There's a handful of people on the podcast so far whose parents were in in African American studies, Black studies of some kind, as undergraduates. I think there's one person whose parent was an actual Black studies professor. So
Wow.
I
Yeah.
think this sort of, from the cradle onward, sort of
Mhm.
connection to Black studies. We should have special episode with all of you to talk about
Yeah.
the Africana studies bookshelf as a child. But there's
Yeah.
also this theme of a theme in so many of these podcasts, whether it's this particular one about your mother being a graduate of the program, um, or just broadly about books in the home. I'm
Mhm.
interested to hear you talk a little bit about also that relationship between that experience of those books in the home and that connection to Black studies and your early educational experience. I mean, was it sort of like a movement back and forth that uh, felt like corrective or sort of alienated from each other, but
Mhm.
also how that bookshelf and that experience like carried over to an HBCU context, but then also into doctoral contexts? Like sort of
Y
really a question of like, what is the sort of long shadow of this?
Of this bookshelf. First of all, like, I still steal from it, like,
That's
you
good. We
know
need to stay that kind of child in relation to parents.
Yes, I still, like, yeah, I still have one of those, like, first editions of Black Power,
Wow.
that were my mom's. I have, that first edition of Young, Gifted, and Black by Lorraine Hansford. I still steal her books. Um, and now I do it because, oh, this is a first edition
That's
more than that because I don't have it. But yeah, I mean, I think the long stretch of it was more that it was somewhat corrective, right? Like, but it was preemptive to any correction as well.
mm-hmm.
So I just had a lot of, I had a mandate to, as a child, be very curious about what I was being taught
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and to come home and report on that thing.
Yeah.
And then have my concerns validated and to bring them back. And sometimes it created issues.
Mm.
I distinctly remember, and I was in the International Baccalaureate program in high school, and we were in world history, and I was deeply concerned that we had not covered sub-Saharan Africa at all. Like, we had done multiple nations, development of nations in Europe and Asia. We hadn't gotten to the so-called New World yet, but like, why hadn't we talked about Africa? And I had all of these books in the home about like the kingdoms of Benin and on all of that. My mother was telling me that, your history starts not at slavery, but before slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was a you know a concern, a conundrum I had about what I knew was at home on my bookshelf, on my parents' bookshelf, like me are still calling it mine, my parents'
I like that.
bookshelves, and what I'm being taught as like an official narrative in a classroom where I'm like one of three or four Black students, right? And what that meant.
Mm.
Because then I also felt like I had a privilege in knowing there is a different way of understanding world history.
Uh-huh.
But then I felt like, why aren't we all being taught
Yeah. Yeah.
this in this context? And yeah, so in that sense, it was, you know, corrective in some ways, but I think my mother also prepared me for the ways that I might be taught something different.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I know it comes from her own experience of being taught something different before she went on to go to college and take courses in African American studies. And so that, I don't know, orientation to knowledge
Mm-hmm.
has been what has carried me through. And so in some ways I have been spoiled and spoiled myself in the ways that Blackness is center to my intellectual life. Um, so much that I go to feminist thought, to women's studies at Spelman, I do have a little stint in there from Sarah Lawrence. I transferred from Sarah Lawrence to Spelman.
Ah.
Um, but and my friend Tiara Jones, we always make the joke that I closed the Alice Walker loop because Alice Walker left Spelman to go to Sarah Lawrence, so I went to Sarah Lawrence and then went back to Spelman.
I like
Um, but you know, if you're in a major in either in English literature, which I was I was a double major in English and comparative women's studies. My study was Black literature. My study was Black women's studies.
Mhm.
And then I don't know if it was even at the time of me going into the PhD program at the University of Maryland. Um, But that program was so strongly Black women's studies
Yeah.
centered, right? Like the chair was Bonnie Thornton-Dill, my advisor, it's Elsa Barkley Brown. You know, we had, God rest her soul, Lynn Bowles, Augusta Lynn Bowles was the DGS in my time there. We had, I think in my first year there, they had brought on Michelle Rowley. Like I didn't experience even women's studies or feminist thought as something that, you know, Blackness was added on to is very
Mhm. Mhm.
center to and you know, my first opportunities to teach courses were in the Black women's studies minor there. So I just all of that to say like that bookshelf was both like formative and has, you know, continued impact. I really recently, and this is just another short vignette about that bookshelf. One of the little books that my mother had was a very early chapbook of Nikki Giovanni's.
Hmm.
And you know, like I'm pilfering this chapbook in 8th grade. I distinctly remember it being 8th grade and reading these poems, and it's a whole world of, like, a revolutionary love life that I'm able to, like, imagine for myself, right? And I really recently, um, you know, at the advent of Nikki Giovanni's passing, I was revisiting that early experience with Nikki Giovanni's work, and it's from my mother's collection. And, you know, kind of thinking through my whole relationship to Black poetry is also through my mother. It's also through my grandmother, but, you know, who wrote poetry. And just thinking that I was connected to something called a Black poetic tradition through these early experiences with my mother's bookshelf, and not just my mother's bookshelf, but my mother's and and I, again, I'd have to invoke my grandmother, their orientation to Black poetry as well. So I would be awakened I think I've talked about this before, but I would be awakened on Saturday mornings with, you know, Liza, Liza, bless the Lord. Don't you know these days is word? Like I would be awakened with Paul Laurence Dunbar,
Mm.
you
Mhm.
know? And so, yeah, that's my entire world was like in terms of what it means to have an intellectual life was very much centered in Black study.
I'm so glad I followed up. I mean, there's so much that's interesting in that, and I love, early on you said, that I said sort of how did it work as a corrective or something, and
Mhm.
you changed that word and you said it was more preemptive.
Mhm.
I love that. The preemptive bookshelf is actually like a great title for something I can't write, but
Something.
just somebody out there
Yeah.
enterprising poet like yourself.
Mm,
Um,
mhm.
but I love that as the the bookshelf as preemptive, but
Mhm.
also as animating in all these ways that you outlined. So thank you for that. Also, I just have to pause and say thank you for saying Lynn Bowles' name. Her
Yeah.
son works in my department with me. He's a good
Oh,
friend and colleague,
Shane.
and
Yeah.
she's very missed, and leaves such a legacy at the University of Maryland and in that particular department. So just wanted to pause and say that's
Absolutely.
such a name to have on there, have on here
Mhm.
and said out loud. So, well, let me ask about Black Studies itself and ask what is that sort of portrait that you work with? What is the idea of Black Studies for you? How does it orient you? How does it shape sort of how you think and approach intellectual life, creative life? And I ask this really in the context of its founding, which was
Mhm.
that tension at its origin between the student demand for an intellectual life on campus that was dedicated to the study of the Black intellectual tradition, sociology, art, history, philosophy, and so on. That's what Black Studies departments came to represent, right? And we inherit that, I think, in terms of the field's commitment to an intellectual tradition. But that was also a moment in which Black liberation struggle had really started to contest those boundaries between communities and campuses, between classrooms and ideas and political mobilization and prescriptive action. And I think we inherit that in the idea of Black studies with also the commitment to a certain kind of liberatory politics. And so
Mm.
thinking about, this tension between intellectual life and sort of political commitment of Black studies, sort of in that context, I'm interested to hear you talk about what that portrait of Black studies is for you in 2026.
Hmm. Oh, that's a big one. I think we are definitely at a moment of recentering our those commitments, right? Like of assessing those commitments, facing the instances of capture within the academy that we have found ourselves involved in. Because I really like in this what I'm gonna say is very much influenced by my conversations with my mother is, the extent to which the this moment, with the attacks on the discipline, with the attacks on um higher education even broadly, this moment seems, if not as dire, perhaps even more contested than the moments in which my mother was, you know, as a student making demands of her university to have these programs. And
Mhm.
so I think we have, um, I think what Black Studies has beautifully been able to do is, change the landscape, the intellectual landscape, inside of multiple disciplines, inside of academia, inside of public life, so much so that the open discourse is forever changed by ways of thinking, and that have been inside of Black studies. And I think I also think of Black studies as much more amorphous than a thing that's just in the academy, and so that could be my
Mhm.
own
Mhm.
my own problem. But
That's a virtue, actually.
like, I I think we have to remember I think we're in a moment where we're having to face the what it means to have courage in the face of these kinds of attacks. And so the political commitments that perhaps some of us have, not so much thought weren't important, but became secondary or old hat or belonging to another generation are not belonging to another generation.
Mhm.
They are like ours. Um, I think we can I think the position what makes Black studies itself so powerful within this moment of the larger attack on higher education is that we've developed a language for talking about why that is
Mhm.
and what that means. And this attack is a direct hit at the gains that we have. So I like while I think that there are ways in which there are moments of capture, um, there are ways that we have leaned into, what people would call like the neoliberal university. Um, there are also tools that come from those earlier demands, um, that also have a lot of power for this present moment. And I think the moments of capture specifically are where we have found the biggest struggle,
Hmm.
right? In terms of the ways that we might commit to uh, student demands currently, um, the way that we might commit to uh, what those student demands are in the context of a global, in the context of thinking about genocide, in the context of thinking about of addressing um the exploitation of natural resources and multiple genocides, and on top of that, in the context of thinking about extinction of entire species. um we we have been captured in that in many ways, but then I do think we have the tools for understanding how that capture happened. So, and in thinking about those tools, I'm always really amazed at how brilliant our colleagues are in beginning the discourse for the next thing. So, like this movement or this, I'm thinking about my colleague Aisha Finch's work in Marinage, um, the ways that that scholars have been talking about fugitivity. I'm thinking about Alexis Pauline Gumb's work on the undrowned, and how all of these orientations are to a future that sees the next thing and how we might respond to the next thing. Um, and so in that sense, I'm not saying that we're going to be all right,
Hmm.
but I do think our commitments remain the same, in many ways, and in that sense, I'm hopeful
Hmm. Hmm.
for that.
Thank you. That was fantastic. A really thoughtful and interesting, a really important way of thinking about these questions of the relationship between intellectual and political life. And, I'm thinking about this last bit that you were saying also, because, whenever I have these moments, always like a little intro podcast reference, but
Mhm.
Ron Manigault Bryant's episode, which was like
Mm.
a month ago, she had this phrase that has stuck with me, and some of my students are sick of hearing it already. So, Ron, if you listen to this, I told you I was going to talk about it, and I
Yeah.
have, where she says, Black Studies was born moving. And so
Mhm.
when
Love
you're
that.
talking this last bit, that kept coming to mind. It's like, it was like, Black Studies is about motion and
Mhm.
the word's overused, but innovation, right? And
Yeah.
and and an ability to assimilate like a whole set of problems, even inside of capture,
Yeah.
as you articulated it. And so, I don't know. I just wanted to sort of note that resonance for me listening to you talk, and I think it's such a provocative and really important way of framing this and thinking about it. So, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Mm. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
And, this I'll transition into asking about your own work in relation to Black studies here. That your work is, invested in Black feminist studies, questions of gender, cultural studies, and also your own creative work.
Mhm.
I'm interested, there's so many insights into Black life that come from this collection that your work has shown and will continue to show. And I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about your own work in relation to the field of Black studies, where you think it fits in the history of the field, but also what boundaries you think it pushes or what new horizons you think it opens up.
Hmm. What a huge question to think about myself in the context of history. I Mm. So I think I say this a lot to my colleagues, to my students. I think I've already said it here in some ways, is that my understanding, orientation, commitments to Black to feminist thought has always been Black. It is like it's never been an arrival to understanding that feminism could be Black too. Um, it's like very much the opposite, very
Mhm,
much the
mhm,
opposite. And so, with that as like my foundation of understanding kind of what Black feminist thought is and what, what feminist thought to me is as Black feminist thought, I really have commitments to um thinking about thinking differently about how thought arrives, how knowledge is produced, and because you know I you know, I've learned all of these formations of what it means to think about gender differently, what it means to think about gender in relation to power differently, about how it's all connected to other forms of difference, like as in
mhm,
class and race, et cetera, ability, etc. Um, those the way that I came to know these things were always outside of academia, um, first, right? Of course, Black feminist theory, the heavy hitting theory, of course, I came to know that. But what was always compelling to me was that I came to know these things first through things like literature.
hmm,
I
mhm,
came to ask the questions through poetry, through music, and so through visual art. And so I'm much more interested in my own life, my own my own life of knowledge production, in being in that discourse
mhm,
and taking seriously that creative practice as a kind of discourse. Um, and so I think, those of us who do cultural studies, who are also practicing in some kind of creative form of production, are I think we're all aware of that having its own set of discourses, that having its own set of references, of citational practices,
mhm, mhm,
and then also reach,
hmm,
a capacity to speak with, um I wouldn't even necessarily say a broader set of people, but perhaps a broader audience, and an audience that can access what knowledge is being produced through, and this kind of leans into my work specifically, understanding through feeling,
mhm, mhm,
understanding through the way something is known that isn't just through the ways of knowing that are acknowledged by the academy,
mhm,
by
mhm,
like reason and all of that. And so that's so I see myself in relation to a long history of Black thinkers, Black feminist thinkers, Black women thinkers, Black queer thinkers who have done their intellectual work, their political work creatively.
mhm, mhm,
Um, I was listening to your podcast earlier, with Kira Gaunt, who is my hero, and we share a hero in Bernice Johnson Regan. Um, and um, one thing that I recall that Dr. Regan has said before is something about how, you know, Black culture has a lot of work to do, right? It may document a present moment in its reiterations of itself. In this way, she's talking about a song. It might document yet another moment. It does a thing where it carries its own philosophies, its own orientations to life. Like, I have a right to the tree of life is its own philosophy, but it might also mark the moment of a particular race riot. In the moment of it being sung, it'll also have a haptic, um, it'll do some haptic, physical, some what we might call somatic work
Mhm.
in the body, right? And so that is a lot of work for one little song to do,
Yeah.
right? And I think that that's true for so much of the creative work that Black women have done. It's not just I'm reimagining something to change the visual landscape of a thing and to make people think differently about the Black female form. I'm also marking time. I'm making a commentary about the trope of the welfare queen. I'm also telling a real story about a real woman who um, sacrificed for her family. Like, and when you encounter this image, I'm specifically thinking of one image by Amy Sherald, right? And when you encounter this image, you are drawn to the strength of this figure, the beauty of this figure, and everything that it makes you feel moved to feel. And so I think in a world right now where we are bombarded with slop images, slop music. We are being our brains are kind of being rewired by algorithms that are like feeding us things that we kind of like deep in the stem of our brains like
Mhm, mhm.
are craving. I think it matters that there is an intentional place to go to think and feel. And I would like to think that my work is asking for that, um, or is is aware of that, in conversation with that. The films, I think this is why I err toward having a more meditative um, uh, vibe, if you will, to the films that occur inside of my books, because I want there to be a pause. I want us
Mm, mhm.
to stop and take in a bit of scenery of the Puget Sound, um, to pause and understand the depth of what grief is in the larger context of things, like a singular grief, as well as like the grief that we're experiencing on an existential level. And so I'd like to think that my work is asking for us to make those pauses, to be able to sit in the complexity of human life a bit.
I love that. Thank you. It was really interesting and thoughtful, and um, I I hope that when people listen to this and hear that, it's like a moment to go back and read like work that of yours that they even are familiar with, because that was a very rich way of thinking about what you're doing and where you're trying to take us in your work. I really love that. Thank you. And I mean, sort of this follow up is sort of developing that, and this is, I'm thinking a lot about how difficult it is to put you in a sort of category of kind of intellectual or kind of knowledge producer, um, as a writer, and then I'm also interested about classrooms and asking this in the context of your own education, as you said, women and gender studies has been your undergraduate and also your graduate degree. That's where you've worked as a professional, and now you're in a Department of African American Studies. And what is striking for somebody doing this podcast is you've never passed through a discipline. You're not sort of coming from English into women and gender studies and Black studies. And so I'm interested to hear you also talk a little bit about how working outside of traditional disciplines has shaped how you think about a research project
Mm.
and do a research project, but also how it shaped how you construct and practice a classroom.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I will say, I can't forget I am a double major undergrad in English and
Yeah.
comparative women's studies. And I have to
Okay,
shout
that's good.
out I have to shout out my forever professor, Opal Moore, who was my senior advisor, and she, is also a poet, and she also identified me as a poet as an undergrad and kind of took me under her wing in particular ways. So I even think, even in the discipline and disciplining inside of English has always uh, placed creative production itself, placed creative writing itself
Mm-hmm.
ahead of my ahead of any other aspect of the discipline for me. And that's to say, what I was able to do from a young person in my undergraduate institution and throughout was to have the idea first that I wanted to explore and see if it failed, and understand that idea through different methods. So
Mm-hmm.
like what
Mm-hmm.
what it meant to be interdisciplinary in my research and in my intellectual life meant asking the questions, okay, is I have this question, does it make more sense for me to ask some people about this? Um and so here I am researching methods for in ethnography,
Mm-hmm.
researching like what it means to might interview somebody.
Yeah.
Does that work? Okay, maybe that doesn't work as much. That works a little bit. It very much clashes with the orientation of literary analysis in which the author must be dead, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what am I saying about what needs to be known by deciding to interview the artist, like those questions have at their core like a different orientation to what it means to create and what the process of creation is. It doesn't make that mysterious. It makes that practical. It makes that labor. Okay, how might if I have that question and what do I do with that question when the author literally is dead? Do I go to the archive? Now, what are those methods in actually
Mm-hmm.
digging in someone's archive?
Yeah.
How do I know what I am needing to look for? How do I construct a narrative out of that? How do I call myself interpreting this material? Right. Um, and so I like in my own kind of research, what that has meant that allowed me to do is I get to put at the front of everything the subject of my research
Mm-hmm.
as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to the discipline
Mm-hmm.
first. In so many ways, I saw like if I had approached any of the artists, any of the the writers that I've written about in Phelan, for instance, from the discipline in which their craft is acknowledged. If I had done an art history to work on the visual on Metavo work Fuller. First of all, Renee Ader already did that, but um, what would I have missed? Like
Mm-hmm.
I would have missed this whole question that I have about what compels these Black women to create images, to revisit images of Black motherhood. What do these images of Black motherhood over time tell us?
Mm-hmm.
In order to do that, I understood myself to have to go beyond. So how this transfers in the classroom to me is, I do have that romantic and, problem solving classroom way of
Mm-hmm.
approaching, pedagogy. And that is, students, what are your questions? Like where do you come to your assumptions about the subject matter at hand, whether it be kind of constructions of manhood and womanhood in the Black community, to reference a class that is over there at
Mm-hmm.
College Park,
Yeah.
right?
I was like, I know that title.
Yes,
It's in a
it was
major
one
in
of
my
my first
department.
classes. Yes, yes, it was one of the first classes I ever taught. And how we'll start with the assumptions we have. Okay, how did you get those assumptions?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you got them from news media, you got them from films, you know. Where might you find some other um ways of interfering or learning more about those assumptions. Oh, you might find them anecdotally. You might want to talk to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Okay. You might also want to look in the history, like how did people think of who Paul Robeson was as a man? How did the idea of kind of thinking about Black civic engagement, Black being legible, Blackness being legible in a kind of idea of what it means to be a citizen or a human through manhood. Like you might want to look at some archives. So
Mm-hmm.
we already have, by kind of thinking about the subject matter itself and orientation to understanding that to really get a larger grasp of a concept means interrogating it through different means, interrogating it through different methods. Um, and so that's how it really comes up in the class. So, when I've done, and I'm just thinking about these kind of intro feeder courses, into the discipline, what ends up happening is I ask students to think about how they might want to, not only the ways that they might want to interrogate the question, but then what is the best way that they understand that this information needs to be expressed,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And of course, in this age, that means a lot of podcast assignments, right? But they get to choose the mode of expression. I've had students create short films, right? Some students are like, I am a student and I'm going to write you a paper. Fine,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
But in asking students to think about what about this material, like, and this is a real question I ask them, you get to make an output of this assignment that is your choice. What about this particular choice makes the most sense?
Yeah.
And then you have them at the very least thinking about how the ideas themselves shape the medium, shape the methods
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that they come to embrace.
Yeah, I do a very not similar. I do the same thing, right? I try to get them to think about what is the best way to answer the questions that you have,
Mhm.
and it's interesting. I mean, it's just part of having been professionally schooled, and I don't think this is like even a negative, right? I mean, we have to
Mhm.
school people, and so there will be norms and habits, but they resist or get very. Not, I shouldn't say resist. Get very nervous
Yeah.
about doing something other than an essay. And one of the things I've really liked about being in Africana Studies is I can always say, well, just look at what we talked about in this class. Like
Mhm.
it's okay for the assignments to kind of look like the material. It's like we've
Yeah.
looked at films, we've talked about
Mhm.
music, we've looked at poetry, we've looked at personal essays and memoirs, as well as analytical pieces. And so if it's worth it, if it's worthy of being on the syllabus, it's also worthy of your assignment, because at some point
Right.
somebody just said, I can't really do this in an essay. It needs to be a film. And I'd love to say they are revolutionized by that, but I would more modestly say they're made a little less anxious, but one step at a time. But it's a one
Right.
step at a time, which I think you've really articulated nicely, is not just about being led by the question and what's appropriate to the question, but also attending to where our humanity is pulled into this, and
Mhm.
that's ought to not be a secondary concern of our classrooms ever.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and they can take it in all different kinds of ways, like in terms of the confines of being in a classroom
Yeah,
and in a semester and trying to crawl to the end of the semester.
yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah.
I do get colleagues sometimes who are like, "What if you get a really mediocre like film or poem or essay?" I'm just like, "How many mediocre essays have I read in my career?"
Right.
That happens.
Right.
It doesn't guarantee everything's going to be great, but
Yeah.
it makes it fun. It's not fun. It's deeply gratifying
Yeah.
as a teacher to see students take those big steps towards their voice.
Right.
I love
Yeah.
the way you put it. You didn't say that you were encouraged to be a poet by your English professor at Spelman. You said she identified you as a poet, and that's the
Yeah.
power of classrooms, is to
Yeah.
feel identified by a
Mhm.
teacher. I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah. It's really powerful to be seen.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I have two more questions for you. And this first one is sort of big, sort of past and future of Black studies. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. What do you think Black studies historically has done well? And what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Oh, I think oh, okay, give me a moment. I know you gave me these questions ahead, but I don't I what I think we've done well with is I do think we've done well with placing with changing what the margin is and what the center is,
Mm-hmm.
and challenging those notions of margin and center, right? I do think, in terms of my own intellectual life and what I, see with my grad students and I see kind of emerging with undergrads is, okay, what does it mean to like not think of blackness as peripheral
Mm-hmm.
to life? It's not like an outlier to the question, to big questions like public health, but like an indicator of what
Mm-hmm.
public health is, or um, to think of like American literature as Black literature because it is,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, there's no American canon without Morrison. I think that's square, right? So,
Would hope
um,
so.
like, don't argue with your mama, like on that one.
Mm-hmm.
But like, I think it's done that really well, and I do think that's the point at which it becomes the most vulnerable to attack because there are forces that do not want that to be true.
Yeah.
Um, so I think this moment is just showing us how very, very powerful this discipline is and has been, and will be. And I think where we I think we might not have thought clearly about the points of capture um that I talked about earlier. And unfortunately, I think we're still having small, silly wars about discipline, about gender and sexuality. And those small, silly wars are like, have the potential to be breaking points or fracture points um, in our current moment. It has kind of dissolved, or it has had the power to dissolve a kind of trust that we're all aiming for the same thing. And I'm absolutely certain that we're all aiming for the same thing. So I think the extent to which, those moments of capture, whether in a kind of disciplining inside of disciplines in the academy, or through the points of thinking about how Black studies has had to expand from, you know, its earlier instantiations of itself, which,
Mm-hmm.
we know have masculinist, heterocentric kind of,
Mm-hmm.
all of those concerns. I think we need to take the lead um, of the subsequent generations of this discipline and understanding the ways that our greatest strength in situating Blackness at the center actually can be informative for how we meet this moment in relation to all of the questions we might have.
Thank you for that. I love you coming back to capture in that way. That's leaves us a lot of things to think about. And my last question is another sort of things to think about question, and maybe that's already, down the path of what you have in mind. Because I wanted to wrap up by asking you, what is the one question you would want us to be asking, and what is the one issue you would want us to be thinking about in Black studies?
I don't know if there's one.
I don't think anybody has ever said just one. Everyone's like, why did you say one? And I'm like, we got time. We don't have a limit on the recording software.
I mean, I'm really interested. I'll say what I'm interested in and I want to see more of. I'm really interested in how we might talk about um, our relationship to the environment, to climate, um, to, what I guess some folks are calling the Anthropocene. So that work is being done, but I also, yeah, I think more of that. I think I'm very invested and interested in that at this moment. I'd also like for us to think about what it means to do the work that we're doing in the midst of a technocracy, um, in the midst of oligarchy, that centers the technocrats, um, in the moments. And I think we have the tools for thinking about it because of how our discipline has already engaged in discourses around surveillance.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think those things are very interrelated. I'm very curious about how we might think about the way that those things are related. Those are the questions that keep me up at night, very truly. Yeah.
I think they should keep us up. So I want to say that's a great place to wrap up, which it is a great place to wrap up because those are questions that should keep us up. But it's hard to be kept up at night. But in these really difficult moments, I think having some precision, refinement, focus, and thoughtfulness about these kinds of questions that keep us up are really, really, really essential. And you've articulated that across so much of this, so many of these crucial questions that are questions of pleasure and exploration, but also of defensiveness, combat, and survival. So that's just a way of saying, this has been a fantastic conversation, Bettina. I'm really so happy we had the time. Really thoughtful, really generous with your thoughts and time. And this is an excellent contribution to the series. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate being invited.
Well, have a great rest of your day.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
So long.